you know, we are getting to the semester marks and all of that. You have been coming to my office to bother me. So, yes, I'm Frank Lekaba. I'm teaching in politics department, and we are in government. That's our school here. So, without wasting of any time, I'm going to invite Professor Tumimzini, who is our to come and welcome you and reflect probably on the Northwest University and the school and this project on Hleketa, this project that we call Hleketa. Hleketa is a Sitonga name meaning thinking. So we are here to think. So without wasting any time, Prof, you may come to the podium to welcome, especially Professor Crane Sudin and Professor Neo Cosmos. Professor Crane Sudin.
Good afternoon. Absheni. Namaste. Goeie aand. Dumelang. How are you this afternoon? In full, it's Lorraine Buitumelo. To meet short for Buitumelo Mzini. I'm the Deputy Director of the School of Government Studies in the Vaal campus. It gives me immense pleasure to extend a very warm welcome to all of you present here on behalf of the entire School of Government Studies, Faculty of Humanities at the Northwest University in the Vaal campus. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, our school comprises of the two departments, Public Administration and Political Science, spread across the three campuses in Vaal, Mafikeng, and Potchefstroom. Our school comprises of three campuses in Vaal, Mafikeng, and Potchefstroom. In hierarchy, as we know, we have the Vice Chancellor, we have deans, executive deans, deputy deans. Coming through, we have directors. In our school, we are in the Faculty of Humanities. We have our executive director, Prof. Pamela Maseko. We have three deputy directors. Prof. Mpochaka, he's based in Mafikeng. Prof. Mpochaka, yes, in Mafikeng. We have Community Engagement, Deputy Dean also, Dr. Aaron Chizumba, is based in Mafikeng. And on Vaal, we have Prof. Mirna Nel, I'm sorry, we used to saying the surnames mostly. It's Prof. Mirna Nel, who is based in Vaal. She's responsible for research and innovation. And I think that is her terrain, hence we are here coming to share knowledge with our guests. Our school director is Prof. Luni Vermeulen. She's based in Potchefstroom. We have our deputy director. We have two deputy directors in the school. One is based in Mafikeng, Prof. Victor Ojakurotu, in the field of political science. And we have myself, Prof. Tumimzini, who is responsible for Vaal with my research focus in public administration. Further, we have two subject chairs in each module, political science. We have Prof. Liri and Mr. Seisman Mutloung and Peter in Potchefstroom. Further, in public administration, we have Prof. Lukamba, based in Vaal, and we have Prof. Melvin Dederiks, who is based in Potchefstroom. Those are our leadership in order to drive this boat of the School of Government Studies. Currently, we are working on establishing a research unit which will focus on sharing knowledge, captivating the hidden topics. Sometimes as you go along through academia, you have those untouched topics, untouched information. So as a school, we are there as well to ensure that such untouched or undark information, we are there to ensure that we dark the information in order to share with the people. Hence, we have the research unit, which will capacitate in terms of sharing information. And we feel honored also to our guest, hoping that you'll be part of our research unit. It's in its infant stage. Almost it will be jumping to a toddler stage. So we wish you and we welcome you to be part of this knowledge sharing pathway with us. Our school is popular to today's and everyday agenda in terms of community development. As they say, School of Government Studies. When you see the word government, you think, oh, it's working with people, development, politics. So it is popular in that sense, unlike other, although yes, they are important, but we think that our school is important because it's everyday life. If somebody doesn't understand why are they making this policy, an example of Department of Education, there's a policy that has been drawn currently on TV, the grade 9 certificate, and a lot of people are saying, but why are they doing this? This is useless. But as a student or as an academic in public administration or politics, we are able to enlighten them that no, this is for a good cause, there has been a problem, and government is tackling this throughout a better process. So as students, as scholars, we are there to enlighten and to share knowledge in order to capacitate those who are unable to get the information or who are clueless of what is happening in terms of the development or current developments. We provide teaching and learning to young and employed scholars coming across the 3 spheres of government. In terms of employed scholars, we have undergrad, postgrad, and in postgrad we have honors, masters, and PhD. In terms of the employed scholars, we have scholars from the private sector, the NGOs, and in government, local government, provincial, and national government. We have the honorables in our classes. It's not only the young stars whom we are teaching. Also, we are imparting knowledge to ministers, the honorable presidents, local mayors, local government mayors. So it's a variety and there's diversity within how we share the knowledge. We take part in research as a form of sharing knowledge, as I indicated, and making inquiry to the unknown. Community engagement is part of our mandate also to provide benefits to the communities and stakeholders as a form of contact research. A lot of staff members, they partake in contact research. For instance, they developed policy, let's say grade 9 certificate, then they'll be going out checking what is the problem based on community members. Do they like the problem or they have disadvantages to the problem? So contact research results to that. Further, in our school, we also provide workshops to staff members in the private sector, in government. And we also have entities where we do volunteerism. It's not only that you have to work to get money, but also you have to impart that legacy to others. So we do volunteerism as well by staff members and students. In our school, as we have public admin, Department of Public Admin and Political Science, for each module we have more than 500 students across campuses in Vaal, Potchefstroom, and Mafikeng. for each levels, first year, second year, and third years. And with honors as well, we have a class of plus minus 25 with honors, and we have PhD students as well. This year in Val, we graduated 4 students. Correct me, colleague? It's 4. 3 PhDs. Last year we had 5 PhDs. So we are really working, and we look forward to have you students. I know you are third years to come for honors and for masters and end up with PhD. Furthermore, we provide postdoc opportunities for those who have completed their PhDs, where they can do research in association with the university. As a university, as a school, we also have networks with outside community members and stakeholders. We have extraordinary researchers who also form part of the university. We do research with them. Mostly they come from institutions where they are not within the academic area. So we work with them in order to increase the knowledge gap within our communities. The university also, through the departments, we have programs which are facilitated to ensure that growth and development occurs within the institution. The program like this, Tleketa, it's there to ensure that we share knowledge. And sharing knowledge is not only about staff members in-house. We have also to seek opportunities outside in order to gain knowledge. And as we have people coming from outside, coming to the institution, we ensure that the information that they provide and the knowledge that we have, we combine, and it makes a huge big tree where people, when they walk outside, they'll be able to come and take on the fruits that we've grown in this big field of knowledge. I'd like to thank the Department, Political Science and International Relations, to ensure that we have an occasion like this. As I indicated, we have a lot of new developments within the unit. So this is the first of its kind, and we are glad that it has been successful. We hope that next time it will be a full marquee, full of chairs, black and white, or red and white chairs, where we share knowledge in a big capacity. Mr. Seisman, Mr. Frank, we thank you very much for the opportunity that you've provided to us and the students and our colleagues who are our guests to come and share the knowledge with us. Normally we say books are written, but where do they end up? So now it's the time. And with the theme of the university, it says it starts here. The books that are written, we are the first to have that knowledge that is shared on us. When we grew, we read books of Klute, Van der Merwe, Hanekom, but we did not know those people. And we thank the university for the opportunities that they give to us, that the person has read the book, we read it, it's part of our syllabus, but now we are able to engage with the people who wrote the books, who provide knowledge to us. And Dr. Piet Krokamp, thank you also for taking care of this steering wheel. And I know you have a lot of work in your table there. We hope that as we share the knowledge, we bring light to you. My colleagues, our guest, Prof. Crane Sodin and Prof. Michael Nokosmos. We hope, have I spelled?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I hear the laughter on the side. We hope you have an engaging and enriching session for this evening with our students, whom are our stakeholders, and to you also, students, colleagues, Prof. Lukamba, Prof. Ofisi. We hope that you enjoy the sessions. Make questions. There's a session for question and answers. Have those questions ready. If ever, write it down so that you can pass it or we share as we will be taking it through to our guest. We hope that you have a wonderful evening sharing knowledge. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. I forgot, colleagues, that we are live streaming. Yesterday, I saw Deputy President was confronted with a question on industrial revolutions, and it was very difficult to to explain the previous three. And Prof. Crane, you'll remember this. One time we had a conference, and I remember Professor Jansen provocatively saying, if a politician speaks about fourth industrial revolution, ask him what are the other three before we speak about the current one. And it was actualized yesterday in Parliament. Yes, thank you very much, Prof. That was a nice welcome. Now it means we can sit down and relax, colleagues, and be ready to engage. This promises to be a feast, a feat, and it promises to be a buffet, both of food and of food for thought. So we thank you very much, Prof, for introducing our university and our school, what we do and all of that. So I will briefly reflect on the biographies of our speakers. We're not going to have a long program, colleagues. So I will briefly reflect on the biographies of our speakers, and then we'll go straight into the discussions, into the presentations and discussions. We'll start with Professor Neo Cosmos, who has written a book, Thinking Freedom in Africa Toward a Theory of Emancipatory Politics. So we are starting from a theoretical base, and then we are hopeful that now Professor Crane, when he reflects on his book, he will tell us how the Cape Radicals took this theory into practice. So this is why when we're thinking about this event, we thought of these two books and these two authors, that there's a synergy somewhere. So, but we are going to have that today. So let me start by introducing Professor Michael Neo Cosmos. Prof, one time one of my students was saying, that professor that you invited, neo-colonialism. I said, no. Professor Michael Neo Cosmos is Emeritus Professor in Humanities at Rhodes University in South Africa, and a distinguished visiting scholar at the University of Connecticut Humanities Institute in the United States. He is the author of many articles and several books, including From Foreign Natives to Native Foreigners, Explaining Xenophobia in South Africa. This book was published in 2010. So you see, we are dealing with scholars who are dealing with complex issues in our society, deconstructing issues here. And the current book that we'll be engaging on is titled Thinking Freedom in Africa Toward a Theory of Emancipatory Politics. It was published by Wits University Press, December 2016. So it's fairly out of the oven. We can still eat it and enjoy. This last book was awarded the Frantz Fanon Prize for Outstanding Work by the Caribbean Philosophical Association in 2017. Prof is currently working on a book provisionally titled The Dialectics of Emancipation in Africa, as well as, this is the second one, an anthology of African political thought from ancient Egypt to the present. So those who are doing political theory, honors students, this should be one of those books we are anticipating to have in our shelves. And those who are doing African politics this semester, it's one of those books that you must anticipate. We must just be waiting, we must be on Google to see when is the book coming. These books are funded by Council for the Development of Social Science in Africa, CODESRIA. We'll have a respondent to the input that will be made by Prof. We'll have a respondent by Mr. Seisman Motlung, who is a lecturer in politics and a coordinator of our discipline. Professor Crane Sudin holds a PhD from the State University of New York at Buffalo and is a former Deputy Vice Chancellor of the University of Cape Town, where he remains an emeritus professor in education and Africa studies. His publications is in the areas of social difference, culture, education policy, comparative education, educational change, public history, and popular culture, including 4 books, 4 edited collections, and over 200 articles. That is scholarship there. These articles include, among other things, reviews, reports, and book chapters, including a 2017 publication titled Nelson Mandela, Comparative Perspectives of His Significance for Education. He is involved in a number of local, national, and international social and cultural organizations, and is a chairperson of the Independent Examinations Board. He's a former chairperson of the District 6 Museum Foundation, a former president of the World Council of Comparative Education Studies Societies, and has served as the chair of 3 ministerial committees of inquiry, including the Ministerial Committee on Transformation in Higher Education and the Ministerial Committee to evaluate textbooks for discrimination. He is a fellow of a number of local and international academics and serves on the boards of a number of cultural heritage, education, and civil society structures. I don't know if I mentioned that Professor Crane Sudin is currently the CEO of Human Sciences Research Council. He's my former boss. So we'll have the program unfolding like that. We'll have a respondent to the speech, the input of Prof. Crane. The input will be done by Dr. Pete Crocamp, our senior lecturer in politics and international relations. Dr. Crocamp has already written a review on a book, Prof. It's there on the newspapers. Yeah. So, colleagues, these are the colleagues here to engage us without wasting any time. We'll start with Professor Neocosmos, and Seisman will give a response, and then we'll have Professor Crane. But I will try to come in between to see to it that there is engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm supposed to wear this thing.
You ready?
I was instructed to wear the.
Okay.
I'm not used to it. Can you give me a hand here?
This is 4th industrial revolution.
Yeah, 4th. No, this is probably the 3rd, actually.
Just put this
in the pocket. If I can find a pocket. In other words, you have to have pockets for these things to work, otherwise. Forget it if you don't have a pocket. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for asking me to come. For the Department of Political Science, School of Government, I should say all protocol observed. Isn't that what they say in government? So I don't have to go through the list of all the people. This is the book that was mentioned. It's unfortunate. It's originally I wanted to publish 2 books, but the publishers insisted in having it in one, which means that it's rather unaffordable. At the last count, it was 400, which is actually not all that much different from yours, which was 350, I think. So, in other words, in terms of weight, you get more for this. Well, it's the same publisher, you see, so we have to kind of, this weight for weight, or page for number of pages. I want to say, I was asked to speak or to say something from the book, and I spent a lot of time thinking what I would do, but I want to give you a talk which I have entitled Thinking Emancipatory Politics as an African Collective Creative Process. So without further ado, let me get into this, and then we can talk in some detail about it later. Today we are confronted, it seems to me, throughout the world, by a liberal conception which restricts freedom, equality, and justice to a minority, while denying it systematically to the overwhelming majority of the world's population. And this, I think, is becoming more and more and more obvious. Let me give you some data which I like to repeat, because I think it's good to have this behind our minds before we start talking at all about emancipatory politics. According to Oxfam, in 2016, the wealth of 3 South African billionaires is equal to the bottom half of the country's population. The richest 15% of the country's population own 42% of the total wealth of the country. The wealth of the richest 10% also accounts for 31% of total wealth. They comment, this is Oxfam, extreme inequality creates a society where wealthy elites can have undue power and influence in society and in public affairs, and this is bad for democracy, end of quote. And it seemed to me rather that to speak of democracy in such a context is extremely problematic. The equivalent statistic at world level, incidentally, is that 5 billionaires own as much as 50% of the world's population. 5 billionaires own as much as 50% of the world's population. According to other statistics, the famous French economist Piketty, for example, Thomas Piketty, the income share of the top 1% in South Africa has nearly doubled since the early 1990s. Okay, so that gives you some idea of the massive inequalities we are confronted with, not only in this country, but worldwide. And I think it's important for us to think of South Africa in the world. We tend to be extremely parochial in this country. You know, we think we are the center of the universe, unfortunately. But this is not so. If we try to understand what is happening in this country, in a world context, we might be able to have a better idea of what is happening. Now, one obvious point is that colonial racism has yet to be overcome, not least in post-apartheid South Africa. Although inclusion through assimilation rather than exclusion is now more prevalent among the middle class. In this context, the search for a true secular universal, which does not exclude supposed barbarians, is becoming more urgent. I use the term barbarian in inverted commas because recently the French government gave us a wonderful example of how the West considers the rest of the universe to be barbarians when they were reacting to the violence in their country a few years ago. A prominent intellectual, Domenico Lesurdo, has shown clearly in his history of liberalism that colonial domination was inherent in the idea of liberalism itself. Okay? It's important, especially if some of you are, reading John Stuart Mill, for example. This was made possible by the fact that the idea of freedom and the universality of humanity which it embraced were applicable only to some. The core distinction drawn by liberalism, Lesurdo notes in his detailed history, was between what he calls the sacred space and the profane space. It was only within the former, the so-called sacred space, that the power of the state over the individual was to be restricted. He further argues that from its inception, quote, liberalism was the intellectual tradition which most rigorously circumscribed a sacred space wherein the rules of the limitations of power obtained. It was an intellectual tradition characterized more by celebration of the community of free individuals that defined a sacred space rather than by celebration of liberty of the individual. End of quote. In contrast to the small sacred space populated by free individuals, the profane space was populated by the majority of the unenlightened. Quote, where the distinction between man and nature does not seem to emerge or does not play a prominent role. End of quote. Of course, the latter space was composed of slaves, Amerindians, Africans, and other colonized peoples whose systematic oppression, even to the extent of extermination, was thereby easily justified. These two spaces, although they remain continuous in liberal discourse, are flexible enough, he argues, to adapt to changing circumstances, so that under colonial conditions, they're easily altered into racial spaces. Oppression and exploitation justified by racism were therefore not only fundamental to colonial capitalism, racism was also inherent in liberal thought because the idea of freedom did not apply to the profane space, which was too close to nature to allow for such a concept of freedom. Freedom was therefore identified with distance from natural constraints. The latter required despotic interventions to overcome these constraints. For example, let's take Hegel, whose comments deny a history to Africans are actually quite notorious. Although not usually associated with a narrow conceived liberalism, Hegel provides a useful illustration of a widely held set of assumptions among Enlightenment thinkers. They are worth repeating, however briefly, even though they are reasonably well known, and I hope you do know them. Writing in the early 19th century, Hegel maintains, quote, the Negro exhibits the natural man, notice natural, in his completely wild and untamed state. There is nothing harmonious with humanity to be found in this type of character. End of quote. He concludes, quote, Africa is no historical part of the world. It has no movement or development to exhibit. What we properly understand by Africa is the unhistorical, undeveloped spirit still involved in the conditions of mere nature, and which has to be presented only as on the threshold of the world history. End of quote. Now, he's not exceptional. His comments are based on the crudest racist prejudice of his times. I don't want to continue too long on this, but it would have been extremely useful for Hegel to show of what he calls the history of spirit could obviously not germinate in such peoples, Africans and Amerindians, and therefore that a so-called civilizing mission was clearly legitimate. We all know what a civilizing mission meant. He notes, for example, when he refers to Egypt, quote, that this part must be attached to Europe. The French have lately made a successful effort in this direction. What he's referring to is clearly Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. And if that part of Africa was to be beneficially colonized by Europe, how much more could this be said to have applied to the rest of the continent? So Hegel was not only a man of his times, but he thought like the European racist state of his times. So it should be apparent then that liberal universalism, at least insofar as it comes out of the Enlightenment, is flawed in its very foundations. However, the conceptions proposed since the collapse of the Marxist alternative to liberalism have consisted overwhelmingly in an insistence on identity politics, as so-called meta-narratives have gone out of academic fashion. So the alternative, the clear alternative to liberalism had been Marxism. It was highly influential in the struggles for independence on this continent in the 1960s, but it has, since the 1980s, gone out of fashion. And it has been replaced by an emphasis on identities and the study of identity politics. Identities, however, it seems to me, cannot help us think humanity and propose a universal alternative, but simply lead more and more to the dominance of particularisms, of individual and group interests, in other words. After all, what is supposed to distinguish humans from animals is that they're able to think beyond their narrow interests, beyond animal instincts. As a result, we experience today continuous conflicts as narrow interests are seen as paramount, whether these be ethnic, national, religious, age, gender, or whatever form they may take. Interests in Africa, as embodied in identity politics, located within social place, in other words, where people are located socially, have been studied ad nauseam by cultural studies, and these have not helped us, it seems to me, to begin to understand what humans as humans have in common. And it seems to me that the latter is imperative if we are to begin to overcome the current limitations and problems which the world is currently facing. For a true universalism, as opposed to the false liberal one, is the foundation of any politics of emancipation. We must follow, it seems to me, Fanon's injunction to, quote, work out new concepts, end of quote, and not to rely on dominant liberal precepts if we are to think the universality of humanity. How then are we to begin to think a true human universal? And I think we can begin to do so by emphasizing what can be called displacement rather than place, or exception rather than the rule. And also by looking precisely where liberalism does not look, i.e. among those who have been and are still oppressed. As they struggle together for their emancipation, they regularly invoked universal humanity, often by exceeding in thought their social location or place, precisely because they were regularly excluded from humanity itself. So it seems to me that it's among those who were considered excluded from humanity that one can begin to try to understand a universal conception of the human, precisely because these people were excluded. The African experience is, of course, central here, it seems to me, obviously. However, I hasten to add that I do not think this true idea of universal humanity is to be found already given in African culture, waiting to be discovered and simply adhered to. In fact, it is possible for it to arise in any human culture. However, I do think that it may exist in potential within African cultures. For me, then, the notion of an African potential refers precisely to the exceptional reference to universal humanity made possible by a politics immanent in African experience, which allows for a thought of displacement and hence emancipation. I would therefore like now to comment briefly on the idea of potential, or the possible, if you like, i.e. something that could exist but does not yet do so, but which is also, in a sense, inscribed in the present. It's rather a complex notion, but it's possible to have inscribed in the present, in the society that we live in, a potential idea of something else, of a better world, of equality, for example, among humans. Now this something is a way, for me, is a way of thinking. In other words, a subjectivity, a way of thinking, which is both particular because it is located always somewhere, inherent in a given social situation, but at the same time it's able to express something universal regarding humanity, which is absent in the situation in which it finds itself. I'm going to give you some examples of this. So I don't intend to remain abstract all the time. It is political simply in the sense that it refers to a collective thought practice, i.e. to collective agency. It exists in collective struggle, if you like. Politics in this sense refers to the thoughts and actions which people produce and undertake collectively. In particular, by so doing, they become what philosophers call a collective subject, through affirming their existence vis-à-vis their exclusion by power. For example, very frequently during struggles for liberation, colonized peoples wrote documents which said, "We the people." In other words, they stressed the fact that they were also people. The Freedom Charter, whatever happens afterwards, is a document of this kind. It's a document which stresses the fact that those who were not considered as people before, from now on are considering themselves as people, and, to use Cabral's expression, as makers of history, as agents of history. Now, this is very much what Fanon talks about when he refers to the nation being formed by the actions of ordinary men and women in the wretched earth. For example, he says, quote, "The living expression of the nation is the moving consciousness of the whole of the people. It is the coherent and enlightened praxis of men and women, the collective construction of a destiny in the assumption of responsibility on a historical scale." End of quote. Very similar to Cabral's insistence on the fact that people have to come back to make their own history, otherwise they're not people. Now, the philosophical underpinnings or references I tend to use is a French philosopher who I like a lot, called Alain Badiou, and I follow him in speaking of a potential as enabling what he calls an immanent exception. It sounds contradictory, but I think it's a very important concept. It is a subjectivity, in other words, a way of thinking, which is immanent to a situation. It does not emanate from outside. It doesn't follow from the sky, or it's not imported by colonialism or whatever the case may be. So it's marked by the situation in which it arises, this mode of thinking, but it's also exceptional to that situation. It exceeds, or it transgresses it, if you like. It exceeds the regularity or habitual expression studied by the social scientists, especially sociology. Some of you may have heard of Bourdieu's idea of habitus. Well, for instance, that's what it's about. People are socialized into following rules and regulations. I'm talking about something else. The exception to this, which is marked by those rules and regulations, but is able to transcend them in many ways. So it exceeds the particular situation or culture precisely because it emphasizes the fundamental equality of all humans. because it insists on what humans have in common, not on what distinguishes or separates them. Now, I want to illustrate this argument with references to 3 African examples. I want to suggest that the politics of emancipation has already been apparent on the continent at different times in history, but as with all emancipatory politics, their occurrence has been exceptional and therefore rare. My throat holds out. The first example I want to use to illustrate this argument is something called the Oath of the Mandan, which was, as we will see, fighting a culture of slavery in the 13th century. So popular struggles against slavery by Africans have a long history. And one of the earliest statements against slavery on the continent itself dates, as far as can be established, from 1222. I don't know if in your courses on political science they told you about, what's it called, the Magna Carta in England. Did they tell you about this? Don't worry if you haven't missed anything. But usually, it is considered to be one of the first statements of democracy. And it's more or less the same period as we're talking about here. This is 1222, and it's known as the Hunter's Oath of the Mandan, or the Donsolu Kalikan, or sometimes as the Mande Charter. It's an affirmative document, and I'm going to put it up in a minute because it's on the one of the things I want to show. And it's based on the oral traditions of the Mandinka Hunters Guilds in the area covering parts of modern Mali, Senegal, and Guinea. And it's said to date back, as I said, to 1222, just before the reign of the famous King Sunjata of the Mandinka. And statements from this charter are replete with a recognition of the truth of the universal nature of humanity. For example, the hunters declare that war will no longer destroy villages for the capture of slaves. From now on, no one will place the bit in the mouth of his fellow man in order to sell him. The hunters declare that the essence of slavery is abolished from this day forth, from one wall to the other, from one frontier to the other of the Mande. The hunters declare that each person is free to use his own person as he sees fit. Each person is free and responsible for his own actions, and each person is free to dispose of the fruit of his own labor. End of quote. Now, interestingly, this is not a statement emanating from a state institution, and seems to have inaugurated an event, a real event at the time, for a world in which slavery was an accepted practice. By 1236, a few years later, another Mandinka document, much more clearly of state origin, known as the Kurukan Fuga Charter, had rubbed out all traces of human equality and freedom and replaced them with a statement regarding the hierarchical stratification of society and the rights and duties of each social group. It states inter alia, quote, "Do not ill-treat your slaves. You should allow them to rest 1 day per week and to end their working day at a reasonable time." So this is a document for liberal slave owners, liberal slave owners, you see. "You are the master of the slaves, but not of the bag they carry," end of quote. Now, apart from stressing the obvious fact that Africans have been thinking along the lines of a universal conception of humanity long before it had occurred to the European Enlightenment to do so, it seems important to note that the singularity of the subjective affirmation of the Donsolu Kalikam, in other words, the first document, evidently asserted a universal and eternal truth of the universality of the human. The fact that this episode has been occluded in the history books does not lessen this truth. And at the same time, it should be noted that the second statement amounted to a subjective reaction by power to the first, as it recognized and legitimized the practice of slavery. It thus adapted and moderated the new situation arising from the effects of the universal singularity, and hence the truth of the Donsolu Kalikan, by simply ensuring and reasserting that slavery could continue, but now in a reasonable way for reasonable slave owners. We now have a new world in which the consequences of the truth of the universality of humanity are undermined and extinguished, but in which the slave system is apparently moderated. Moreover, it is this latter document, interestingly, that is ironically seen today as an authentic expression of African culture. The oath of the hunters, on the other hand, being an obviously excessive affirmation, has been quite simply effaced from the history books. Right, can we show these things to these good people now? How do I project this? Oh, this is in French, but I'm going to go, I can move it up and down the usual way? Yes. Just do it on the whole screen, yeah. No, it's not there yet. Hey, man. It's a little bit on the big side, and you might make it a little bit smaller, if you can. If I may be permitted a comment, I think it is extremely important to have a certain amount of discipline if one wishes to become some kind of intellectual, or to think, or to engage in serious debates and to learn. It's not particularly helpful if people are traipsing in, practically an hour after we were due to start. I'm sorry to have to say this, but it's actually a serious, really serious question. I always used to tell students at Rhodes this, that if you want to be intellectuals, you have to be disciplined. You have to pitch up on time. And you have to be there when the lectures start. And you have to be there in order to participate in the discussion. It's no good arriving half an hour later, or 3/4 of an hour later, sorry. So, anyway, let me see if I can move this. Is that, can I see it? Where do I see it? Oh, I see it in front of me, yeah. So, I don't want to do the French, I want to show you an English translation. Can I go up like this? All right, the Mandate Charter of 1222. Can you see that there? Is it big enough? Can you read it? Eh? No. That's, he must, our friendly techie must sort this out. They can't read it. It says, the hunters declare, every human life is a life. It is true that a life comes into existence before another life, but no life is more ancient, more respectable than any other. In the same way, no one life is superior to any other. All right, can we move it a bit to the side so that it can be on. It continues, the hunters declare, you need to give it a little bit of. You want to make it smaller, they're not going to read it. Yes, you want to make 1 page? If you make 1 page, you have to increase it, yeah. Single page. Is that better? Eh?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, no, that's good. The hunters declare, as each life is a life, any wrong done unto a life requires reparation. Consequently, no one should gratuitously attack his neighbor. No one should wrong his neighbor. No one should torment his fellow man. Torment here means something specific, okay? The hunters declare that each person should watch over their neighbor, that each person should venerate their progenitors, that each person should educate their children as it should be done, that each person should provide to the needs of their family. The hunters declare that each person should watch over the country of their fathers. By country or motherland or vassal, one must understand also people. For any country, any land which were to see people disappear would soon become nostalgic. The hunters declare hunger is not a good thing. Where are we? Oh, it's going up. Have I moved this too fast? There is nothing worse than this on earth. As long as we hold the quiver and the bow, the hunters, hunger will no longer kill anyone in the mundane. If by chance hunger were to arrive, war will no longer destroy any village for the acquiring of slaves. Oh. I'm not very successful at this, am I? What happens after slaves here? Come on, don't jump up to, you see, it jumps a whole page. Anyway, you get the gist of it. That is to say, no one will now place the bit in the mouth, yeah, in order to sell him. Furthermore, no one will be beaten, and all the more so put to death because he is the son of a slave. The hunters declare the essence of slavery is today extinguished from one wall or the other. Raids are banned. The torments born of these horrors have ended from this day onwards. What an ordeal is this, especially when the oppressed has no recourse. People from the old days tell us, man as an individual made of flesh and bone, of marrow and nerves, of skin covered in hair, eats food and drink, but his soul, his spirit, lives on 3 things. He must see what he wishes to see, he must say what he wishes to say, and do what he wishes to do. If one of these things were to miss from the human soul, it would suffer and would surely become sick. I think it's an absolutely extraordinary document, especially if you consider that it was written in 1222. Hey, Abutiwe. You know, you're out of order. You must respect me by keeping quiet. This, and they know it's basically 1222 because I think Comet Kauhutek was going past at that time. So it was possible to work out the date with reasonable precision because you know when that comet was appearing at which part of the world. Let me now show you the other one because it's a completely different kind of document. The other one, I told you, was a Kurukan Fugashata, written later, 1236, written very much as a state document. It emanates from power, and you can see why. Because basically it's an analysis of social structure, as sociologists tell us. The Great Mande Society, it's the same society, okay, as the previous one. All right. The Great Mande Society is divided into 16 clans of quiver carriers, 5 clans of Marabu, 4 groups of Nyamakalas, and 1 group of slaves. So you have a hierarchy. Huh? Each one has a specific activity and role. I like the Nyamakalas because they devote themselves to tell the truth to chiefs. Of course, they are the intellectuals of the time. It's something which I find instructive. To be their counselors and to defend by the speech the establishment of the rulers and the order upon the whole territory. You can see where this emanates from. It emanates from those in power and is telling you this is how the society is organized. These are the functions of the various groups. This is what they should be doing. So it's a completely different kind of text to the first one. It continues, however, everyone has a right to life and to the preservation of physical integrity. Oh, the fight against laziness and idleness. Well, those of you who know something about colonialism know that this was one of the main interests of what do you call them? Of the churches who arrived in this country from the West. Never offend women are mothers. That's interesting. Do not ill-treat, there is a bit, do not ill-treat the slaves. We are the master of the slave, but not of the bag he carries. Do not follow up with your constant attentions the wife of the chief, quite clearly. It's not a good idea. Never wrong foreigners. Okay, so I think it's important to try and see if we can compare these two very, very briefly. And to note the clear distinction between a conception of culture underpinned by power, which is the second text. Can you still see it? Yes, you can. That's good. Thank you. And on the other hand, a text which is purely affirmative. It's saying, this is how things should be. This is the kind of society we want. And that's the first one. While the Kurukan Fuga Charter is organized around place, in other words, social location, hierarchy, and the rights and duties ascribed to each social group, the Oath of the Hunters is simply concerned with affirming life over death. It is the universality of life associated with the possession of a soul and the need to fight against death, which here provides the essence of universal humanity. So you can see it is located within a particular culture, but at the same time, it's providing us with a view of what the human is, of what it means to be human. Life had to be affirmed in order to overcome the violence of hunger and the evils of slavery, both of which were closely connected with war and death. Its language is that of an affirmation regarding what must be done to avoid hunger, war and death, namely the abolition of slavery itself. The Kurukan Fuga Charter, on the other hand, is a detailed analysis of social structure. In other words, of hierarchies, rights and duties attached to social place. It tells us how the system must function according to established culture in order to ensure what we today call social cohesion. Transgressions of these cultural prescriptions brings about punishment by power, which is the last 44. All those who will transgress these rules will be punished. Everyone is bound to make effective their implementation. The statement is written in the language of power, of the state in fact. The Oath of the Hunters is not written in the language of power, but in the language of freedom, equality, of the universality of humanity. It is politically prescriptive, not a statement by power. Okay, so you're getting some kind of idea of what I'm getting at. The statement, so-called Donsolu Kalikan, cannot be understood to reflect a common African culture. I would argue, but rather refers to the potential inherent in African culture for exceeding that culture, i.e. the possibility of an imminent exception, as I used earlier, the concept. In fact, the distinction between the Donsolu Kalikan and the Kurung Kan Fuga is precisely the distinction between politics, affirming universality of humanity, and culture. The idea that every person or human life must be treated equally is evidently not to be understood as a habitual feature of African culture, for it is quite apparent that within African cultures people were and are not treated equally. Past African society were not usually egalitarian, with some exceptions of course, because states were widespread by the 18th century, for example. So the point I'm trying to make is not so much about the cultural unity of Africa, but rather, along the lines of Sheikh Anta Diop, for example, but rather the fact that the potential is provided for such culture to be exceeded. It can be exceeded because the thought of the truly universal is extant in African cultures in potential, so to speak. There is no necessity for this potential to be realized in any particular case, but the point is that it does not need reinventing, although it must be actively struggled for to ensure its existence. Should such a struggle not be present, it is likely today to be smothered by hegemonic liberal precepts. Okay, let me now just, because I have little time left, I don't want to ramble on forever and bore you to tears. I want to turn to the second example. Now, the second example comes from Haiti. Haiti, you know, had one of the three major revolutions of the 18th century. 1791 it started, and Haiti became independent, the first black independent country in 1804. Now, the interesting thing about Haiti and that revolution, well, for our purposes, is that the majority of the revolutionaries, of the rebels, of the slaves who were rebelling, were from Congo. They were born in Africa. They were Africans. And they were the most radical. So, what happens is that as Haiti becomes independent, a nation develops which places itself in opposition to the post-colonial state. So Haiti is very, very interesting, because it holds a lot of the features which were later to appear in Africa from the 1960s onwards, in the struggle after independence. Now, independence opened a new historical sequence in Haiti, that of the struggle for the formation of a peasantry. In other words, the ex-slaves wanted to destroy the whole plantation system, not just the slave system, but the whole plantation system, and to set up what's known in the literature as peasant parcels, small-scale peasant, family-based agriculture. One of the experts who writes on Haiti says the following, quote, "Permanent freedom had been won through independence, but the masses had not yet won the freedom to till their own soil. And this, perhaps more than anything else, sums up what the peasant masses expected out of freedom. A personal claim to the land upon which one labored and from which to derive and express one's individuality was for the black laborers a necessary and an essential element in their vision of freedom." For without this concrete economic and social reality, freedom for the ex-slaves was little more than a legal abstraction. I think this is very well put. To continue to be forced into laboring for others, bound by property relations that afforded few benefits and no real alternatives for themselves, meant that they were not entirely free. End of quote. So the land and land ownership then was absolutely central to their way of thinking. Now, without going into too much detail, one of the ways they do it, or they succeed in maintaining a certain amount of equality among themselves, is through the development of a singular form of politics which attempts to distance its thinking from that of the state, of the post-independent state, and which is simultaneously rooted in local traditions of resistance to oppression. Commonly, this subjectivity was expressed in proverbs or sayings, the most important of which was "Tout le monde c'est mou, même si pas même mou." The term "mou," you can guess where it comes from. Can you? Ubuntu. Mou is the same. Hey, munna. Don't people say that? Well, they used to in certain parts of Lesotho. If you go to the Free State or Lesotho, where I spent quite a lot of time, it was munna. Mu is the same root. Okay. So you can see the influence of Bantu language on their particular, in this case, proverb. What it means is every person is a person, even though they're not the same person. Again, there is a stress on universality, that fundamentally every single person is a person, even though they're different. And it's stressing, therefore, the commonality of humanity and what is central to all humans. And the point made by some of the authors on this, discussing this, is that equality cannot exist without difference, and that correspondingly difference makes no sense without equality. For example, one author says, quote, "In order to be different, not to be memu, each man must begin by identifying what he has in common with others. What is the basic identity from which variations can be felt, interpreted, and used?" Now, of course, the reference here is to man, not to woman. But I think the point can be extended. So as a result, whereas variations obviously existed, especially variations in wealth and skills and whatever, they were restricted from becoming hierarchical through group reactions which limited the entrenchment of these forms of behavior. These reactions included the attribution to one person of various statuses in different contexts, so that all status is relativized. So that you could be of high status in one particular context and not so high status in another context. So that status becomes relativized. So you're, in a sense, contesting the development of a hierarchy. Okay? A good reputation or social behavior, personal relations, all contribute to balancing out the purely quantitative differences, so that identification is sought with an ideal of a middle peasant, moyen, as they say. And this author insists that while Haitian rural society is generally understood as a failure, as wedded to traditions and poverty, it is in fact a highly organized social system that is self-regulating without an institutionalized state structure. Finally, I want to refer this time to come back home to South Africa and to talk about this briefly, this other statement. This is by Abahlali Basem Jondolo, the social movement primarily based in Durban, but no longer exclusively based in Durban, when it fights xenophobia. It says each person is a person, wherever they may come from. Notice the similarity. Yeah? Each life is a life. Each person is a person. Not only is the universality of humanity expressed in three completely different contexts, but even the words that they used are so similar. It's extraordinary, right? So this third statement was uttered by Abahlali Basemjondolo, the movement of shack dwellers in Durban, and was explicitly geared against xenophobic violence. In fact, it was made in 2008 after such attacks. Abahlali Basemjondolo contested the reference to migrants as illegal immigrants. They said the following, quote, "There is only one human race. Our struggle in every struggle is to put the human being at the center of society, starting with the worse off. An action can be illegal, a person cannot be illegal. A person is a person wherever they may find themselves. If you live in a settlement, you are from that settlement, and you are a neighbor and a comrade in that settlement." So in other words, apparent foreigners, or those deemed to be foreign, should not be treated differently from anyone else. If you do, you end up emphasizing differences. The next thing is ethnic differences. Next thing is Indians go home. The next thing is, Amakosa should go back to Lusikisiki and all this rubbish that you hear in Durban, okay? It can easily be extended as soon as you start thinking in those identitarian terms. So, I just wanted to refer to them quickly. They have in fact organized politically together with the Congolese Solidarity Campaign, which organizes migrants in Durban. And they write the following about what their politics consist of. Quote, "We have been working to build a politics from below that accepts each person as a person and each comrade as a comrade without regard to where they were born or what language they speak. In this struggle, we have faced constant attack from the state, the ruling party and others. We have been attacked for having members from the Eastern Cape, members born in other countries, and Indian members. We have always stood firm against these attacks." So in conclusion, maybe put these three statements next to each other and see if you can... Can we go right to the beginning? They're right at the top, I think. Every human life is a life. Tumung samung. A person is a person wherever they may come from. It should be noted, I think, first that each one of these statements is directly linked to a struggle for emancipation in one form or another. They make no sense outside of this struggle. So in the first case, it's a struggle against slavery. The second case is a struggle for equality. The third case is a struggle against xenophobia. And second, that each statement illustrates what has been called a dialectic. A dialectic which is both embedded in the particular. Each one of these statements comes out of very specific circumstances, which are completely distinct from each other. So it's embedded in the particular and emanates from that particular, while it's also putting forward a very similar conception of the universal, namely a person is a person. Emanating from a struggle against slavery, a struggle for economic equality, and a struggle against xenophobia, all three are clearly located in the particular, while at the same time transcended. It is this process which can be termed dialectical. And which defines, you've missed it all. You might as well go back out again. And which defines the character of a singular form. This defines the character of a singular form of emancipatory politics. This is what the French philosopher Alain Badiou calls an immanent exception. It is both located in a particular culture, in society, as well as exceeding it, so that it's not reducible to that society. Emancipatory politics can only be thought dialectically, it seems to me. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Prof.
It's okay.
You provoked us.
I'm provocative.
You are. It seems like liberalism is at the crisis point.
Oh, it should.
Both ideologically and in practice. News now is that the DA leader has resigned and Arthur Trollip has resigned.
Everybody has resigned.
Everybody has resigned. So maybe this is an opportunity to reflect, because over the weekend we're bombarded by liberalism. I'm a radical liberal. Liberalism was defined from different contexts, different corners, and all of that. So Professor Neocosmos has given us a historical understanding of the crisis of liberalism, that it has been with us for quite a long time. And what was perceived as an alternative to liberalism, which was is it the socialist or the communist, Prof? Or Marxism or whatever, or let's just say the left. Let's just safely say the left collapsed in the 80s. So he's proposing that we have to think about the alternative. We must start thinking, and that is emancipatory politics. We must start thinking about the alternative because we are in a crisis. Even liberals themselves are in a crisis. So they are living in this crisis, and we are in it as well. And the inequalities cannot be sustainable. Lately, everybody is proud. It seems like the reactionary tendencies have found a space. It seems like they coexist with liberalism. They have found a comfortable space. The reactionaries are able to come out and say, I'm a racist, I'm a sexist. People are proud to say that. People are proud to say, you are a foreigner, go back home. That is the crisis of liberalism. In a nutshell. Salesman, let me not respond. Komuna.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to take this opportunity and thank you for coming, and thank you, Prof. Neocosmos, for the talk. And my response will be mainly based on the book, your book that I read, and also I will factor in what you said. And to avoid maybe talking for too long, I would limit myself to what you have discussed in relation to the context of emancipation, and then this aspect of immanent exceptionalism. So I would want to say basically what you have discussed was equating emancipation with equality. So when we talk emancipation, we mean equality. And equality is one tenet of liberalism. So when we say liberalism, is collapsing, we basically mean that liberalism is betraying its own values. So we see this in society when the promise of liberalism does not fulfill those desires you just shared with us, that people cannot realize, they cannot see what they want to see. So when we cannot see equality, I think this is where frustrations begin. So what you have given us in your book was that emancipation means no fear and no favor. So I think this is the kind of a society, this is the kind of thinking that we want to develop or to embrace, that we should show no favor. Umuntu ngumuntu, or a person is a person. So we should not show any favoritism based on race or gender or particular background. Our background is essentially human. And I'm listening to Andile Mkritama, and he says, when people ask me who ungubani, or let's say Mutlung Wamang, or that kind of a thing, where do you come from, what are your roots? And I tell them my roots are black, I am black. And Lekaba Enai says, when people ask him, Lekaba, who are you, or where do you come from, he says, I am human. So my roots are human. So I think this is where this kind of emancipation, this kind of equality we want to enshrine, because now we move away from the temptation, tribalism, when we regard ourselves as human. I think Professor Neocosmos will not allow you saying I am black or I am white, because this is now a politics of identity, and this is what he wants us to transcend. We should go within this excessive politics without place, politics without particular subjectivities. So, in his book and partly in his lecture here, this is what he's telling us, that there were this politics of subjectivity when first a community would say everyone is human and slavery is not acceptable, slavery ends now. Later on within that community, we now realize a society where there are subjectivities now, that you can be a slave but on Monday and until Friday, and on weekends you are okay, something like that. So these are things that we need to really transcend. So this is the framework within which we understand that the neoliberal economic crisis that emerges now, that within this there is no, or we say we lack a mode of politics that affirm a human, where we say there's a wage, but this wage is not a living wage, or now we call it a humane wage. There is shelter but not a humane shelter. There's education but not a humane education. So others have a better education compared to others. So I would say there is that need of a political system, of a society or social relations that affirm the human. And in this lecture, we understand here, and I think I would take from Dr. Krokamp. He usually, in our corridors, he used to say, you're going to relieve me of my ignorance. And here I was relieved of that ignorance. Looking at the Mandate Declaration, I should confess here that the Mandate I did not know, but the Magna Carta I know. So this is, for me, to some extent, a process of enlightenment in that regard. And here we see that it is also an attempt for emancipation, in that people of the mundane were affirming themselves. And in affirming themselves, I would want to take you to Robin Collingwood. And this is me now drawing parallels from what